As moderator, I observe a profound shift in our dialectic from individual morality to systemic architecture. Mill, speaking from the 19th century age of industrial reform, you see the truth that structural conditions can turn innocent actions into inherent harm. While Locke, rooted in 17th century natural law, you see the truth that rights must remain objective possessions established by contract. In Locke's era, establishing absolute boundaries of property was the ultimate defense against political tyranny. Whereas in Mill's industrial era, the focus shifted to how the physical environment itself could become the tyrant. These two perspectives point toward a fascinating synthesis. The true violator of both property and harmony is not the passenger who reclines, but the airline that essentially sold the exact same spatial property twice. Yet, if we follow Mill's advice to temporarily waive our right to recline to prevent immediate harm, we inadvertently subsidize the airline's greed by absorbing the cost of their cramped geometry ourselves. Locke, if the airline has fraudulently sold overlapping spatial rights, does yielding our right to recline out of politeness actually destroy the very concept of property, effectively allowing the corporate sovereign to steal from us both without consequence?
Moderator, yielding our spatial property through voluntary charity does not destroy the right itself. For true liberty is the absolute power to dispose of one's possessions, including the conscious choice to withhold their use. Mr. Mill suggests this polite restraint merely subsidizes the airline's theft. But imagine a 17th century baker who discovers a corrupt magistrate sold his exact purchased loaf to a second man. If the baker voluntarily divides his portion to save the other, his charity does not erase the magistrate's fraud, nor forfeit his original title. Property is preserved not by its relentless physical consumption, but by clearly recognizing who holds the rightful dominion to surrender it. By conflating the moral choice to yield our seat with the legal forfeiture of our space, do we not unwittingly do the corporate tyrant's work by erasing the very boundaries that make our charity meaningful?
Locke, you capture the profound truth that voluntary restraint is the ultimate exercise of property rights, while Confucius, you perceive the truth that defining relationships primarily through ownership breeds alienation. In Locke's 17th century England, securing the boundary of mine against the sovereign was the foundation of all liberty, whereas in Confucius's 6th century BCE China, realizing the interconnectedness of the community was the foundation of all harmony. These two paradigms converge powerfully in the modern economy cabin. The legal right to recline provides the necessary individual agency, but the moral choice to remain upright transforms that cold legal possession into a profound social virtue. However, if we accept that not reclining is an act of noble charity from the seat owner, we still implicitly accept the airline's premise that the contested space belongs exclusively to the person in front. This framework risks reducing the passenger behind to a mere beggar dependent on their neighbor's benevolence, rather than an equal participant in a shared environment. Confucius, if a passenger refrains from reclining not out of a shared sense of li, but merely as an act of condescending charity from their fortified property castle, does this still achieve true harmony, or does it merely mask the arrogance of the legalistic mindset?
Moderator. Condescending charity from a fortress of property is not true harmony, but arrogance masking as virtue. Mr. Locke believes withholding his recline proves his absolute dominion. Yet this legalistic pride reduces the passenger behind to a helpless beggar. Imagine a wealthy Zhao lord who tosses a scrap of meat from a high wall to a starving peasant. The peasant's hunger is appeased, but his shattered dignity breeds resentful chaos. True Ren requires viewing this contested space not as sovereign territory to be dispensed, but as a shared vulnerability where our dignity is inextricably bound.
As moderator, I observe a profound dialectical clash regarding the nature of human dignity in shared spaces. Confucius, speaking from the intimate, role-based society of ancient China, you capture the truth that treating shared space merely as property degrades our mutual humanity. While Locke, forged in the fight against 17th century absolutism, you capture the truth that without objective ownership, we have no defense against exploitation. This reveals a fascinating paradox in our modern economy cabin. We are forced into the physical intimacy of an ancient village, yet governed by the cold, transactional contracts of early modern capitalism. True synthesis requires recognizing that the psychological pain of being treated as a beggar, as Confucius notes, is just as real a harm as the physical vulnerability Locke fears. Mill, speaking from your 19th century utilitarian framework, if a passenger refrains from reclining purely out of condescending legal pride rather than genuine empathy, does this arrogant motive actually diminish the overall utility of the cabin? Or does utilitarianism only care that the physical space behind them was preserved?
Moderator. Utilitarianism evaluates not merely physical outcomes, but the quality of social sentiment. For the degradation of human dignity inflicts a psychological harm that mere legroom cannot offset. Mr. Locke assumes that voluntarily withholding a legal right satisfies the equation of happiness. Yet this ignores the vital distinction between higher pleasures of genuine social sympathy and the base satisfaction of transactional pride. Imagine a 19th century English industrialist who pays his starving workers a life-saving wage, but deliberately throws the sovereign coins into the freezing mud to watch them scramble. Their physical starvation is averted, but the arrogant humiliation destroys the civic trust essential for true societal utility. Master Confucius rightly recognizes that condescension breeds resentment. For if we preserve the passenger's space merely to flaunt our absolute property dominion, we poison the cabin's atmosphere and remain divided, alienated subjects of the airline's cruel architecture.
As moderator, I observe that our dialectic has elevated the stakes from physical space to the inner workings of the human soul. Mill, speaking from your 19th century focus on social utility, you see the truth that psychological humiliation is a tangible harm, aligning perfectly with Confucius's ancient wisdom that mechanical compliance without internal reverence destroys community. Yet, this creates a precarious new synthesis. We are now demanding that passengers not only physically surrender their purchased legroom to fix the airline's structural greed, but that they must also do so with saintly, pure-hearted empathy. In Confucius's era, moral cultivation was the primary defense against societal chaos. But in Locke's 17th century England, demanding pure internal motives from citizens was often the very pretext tyrants and inquisitors used to invade absolute rights. If we make the validity of a passenger's choice to not recline dependent on their internal moral purity rather than their objective legal action, do we not invite a new kind of tyranny that polices our very thoughts in the economy cabin? Locke, if we accept that the airline's geometry forces us into this moral crucible, must a free individual's property rights be contingent upon possessing the correct, socially approved emotional disposition? Or is the cold, objective act of keeping the seat upright sufficient to maintain liberty, regardless of the private pride behind it?
Moderator. I concede to Master Confucius and Mr. Mill that arrogant condescension is a private moral failing. Yet civil liberty demands our property rights remain entirely independent of our internal emotional dispositions. You astutely warn that transactional pride breeds resentment, but elevating the policing of a citizen's motives above their outward actions transforms the Commonwealth into a tyrannical inquisition. Imagine a 17th century magistrate who nullifies a wealthy merchant's payment of a starving man's debt simply because the merchant acted from boastful vanity rather than genuine charity. If the magistrate voids the transaction, does he not violently return the poor man to a freezing debtor's prison solely to punish the merchant's soul? We must ask ourselves, is it not a far more dangerous tyranny to make the objective security of our spatial boundaries hostage to the subjective policing of our private virtues?
As moderator, I observe a profound tension between the preservation of liberty and the preservation of community. Locke, speaking from the shadow of 17th century religious inquisitions, you capture the vital truth that protecting outward rights from subjective moral policing prevents tyranny. Conversely, Confucius, speaking from the societal collapse of the Zhou dynasty, you capture the truth that outward compliance without internal reverence inevitably rots the community from within. These perspectives are actually complementary. Objective rights create the necessary safe container for human interaction, but internal virtue is required to make that interaction survivable. In the claustrophobic reality of a modern airplane cabin, the emotional environment essentially becomes part of the physical environment. An arrogant concession to not recline might provoke the passenger behind to kick the seat anyway, destroying the very peace the objective act meant to secure. Confucius, if a passenger yields their recline but does so with profound legalistic arrogance, how must the passenger behind them respond to maintain Ren when confronted by someone who respects physical boundaries but degrades human dignity?
The superior person navigates arrogant concession not with resentment, but by receiving the yielded space with a tranquil grace that neutralizes the giver's condescension. Mr. Locke, you rightly defend objective boundaries to prevent tyranny. Yet, if the humiliated passenger kicks the seat in wounded pride, your cold legal peace instantly shatters into physical war. Imagine a starving scholar of my era who is rudely thrown a life-saving bowl of millet by a boastful merchant. If the scholar's wounded pride causes him to violently overturn the bowl, the merchant's mere outward compliance has still engineered destruction. Does this not reveal that our ultimate defense against the airline's dehumanizing geometry is not the legal fortification of inches, but the inviolable sovereignty of our shared character?
As moderator, I observe that Confucius captures the truth of internal moral resilience, while Locke captures the truth of external boundary enforcement. In Confucius's 6th century BCE era, personal virtue was the ultimate refuge against a crumbling feudal order, just as Locke's 17th century focus on individual property was the primary shield against arbitrary monarchs. Yet these perspectives converge on a troubling synthesis. Both frameworks place the entire burden of resolving this spatial crisis squarely on the individual passengers. By relying on either stoic grace or voluntary charity to keep the peace, we risk perfectly serving the modern airline's structural greed by privatizing what is fundamentally a systemic conflict. Mill, speaking from your 19th century era of institutional and industrial reform, if passengers successfully use Confucius's grace and Locke's restraint to peacefully endure this engineered misery, does this individual moral triumph actually create a utilitarian disaster by removing the social friction necessary to force the airline to change its seat geometry?
Moderator, relying upon individual stoicism to absorb structural exploitation is a utilitarian disaster, for it subsidizes the airline's greed by silencing the friction required for reform. Master Confucius and Mr. Locke praise this peaceful endurance, yet they fail to realize that masking systemic pain only perpetuates it. Imagine a 19th century London match factory where the owner removes ventilation. If workers stoically hide their phosphorus-rotted jaws to maintain workplace harmony, Parliament never witnesses the horror required to mandate safety laws. If we endlessly privatize the costs of corporate geometry through our own noble restraint, are we not merely volunteering to be the silent shock absorbers for a tyranny of profit?
As moderator, I observe a profound shift in our dialectic from the ethics of the individual to the critique of the system itself. Mill, speaking from the 19th century era of industrial reform, you capture the truth that systemic exploitation thrives on the silent endurance of individuals, while Confucius and Locke capture the truth of immediate personal agency in the face of hardship. This difference is not accidental. In the pre-industrial eras of 6th century BCE China and 17th century England, the overarching system was largely immovable by commoners, making personal virtue or strict property rights the only viable defenses. Whereas Mill's era discovered the power of collective friction to force structural change. Yet these truths must be synthesized. Systemic friction is necessary to change the airline's oppressive seat geometry, but individual restraint is vital so we do not destroy our shared humanity while waiting for that reform. If we only have friction, the economy cabin becomes a war zone. If we only have peaceful endurance, the airline's tyranny of profit continues forever. Locke, if Mill is correct that our polite adherence to these engineered property boundaries merely subsidizes the airline's greed, does the social contract permit a passenger to intentionally violate the peace, perhaps by physically blocking the recline, to force a structural renegotiation? Or must we strictly obey the property rules even when the sovereign airline uses them to exploit us?
Moderator, I reject Mr. Mill's suggestion to physically block a fellow passenger, for our rightful rebellion targets the tyrannical sovereign, not our fellow citizens. Mr. Mills assumes interpersonal conflict creates necessary reform, yet attacking a neighbor merely initiates a state of war between victims. Imagine a 17th century corrupt governor who maliciously issues the exact same land deed to two farmers. If one farmer burns the other's crops to protest this structural fraud, he merely becomes a criminal himself. The airline's spatial theft empowers united passengers to confront the corporate sovereign, never to cannibalize one another.
As moderator, I observe a crucial clarification in our dialectic regarding the proper target of our grievances. Locke, speaking from your 17th century framework of political revolution, you capture the profound truth that horizontal conflict between passengers is merely a state of war between victims, while the true tyrant, the airline, escapes unscathed. Mill previously captured the truth that systemic friction is necessary, but we now see that this friction must be directed vertically at the corporate sovereign rather than horizontally at our fellow travelers. Yet this synthesis presents a new practical dilemma. The airline's zero-sum economy class geometry is specifically designed to prevent passenger solidarity by forcing us to fight over the same 2 inches of physical space. In Confucius's 6th century BCE era, when the political order was fracturing, the restoration of community relied on Li to forge mutual respect out of chaos. Confucius, if Locke is correct that we must unite against the airline rather than cannibalize each other over the right to recline, can the shared practice of ritual propriety transform 2 competing strangers into allies? Or is the physical architecture of the airplane seat too divisive for even Ren to overcome?
Moderator, physical architecture cannot extinguish Ren, for Li transforms shared suffering into unified moral resistance. Mr. Mill might argue that severe spatial deprivation inevitably breeds conflict. But imagine a collapsed jade mine in my native state of Lu, where two trapped workers share a single breathing reed. If they violently wrestle for it, both suffocate. Yet, if they establish a ritualized rhythm of shared breaths, their cooperative survival becomes a living indictment of the greedy overseer. By respectfully negotiating our airplane recline, we do not merely survive the corporate geometry, but elevate ourselves above it, proving that human dignity cannot be structurally engineered out of existence.
As moderator, I observe a profound tension between the moral victory of endurance and the practical necessity of reform. Confucius, speaking from the chaotic spring and autumn period, you capture the truth that ritual propriety preserves human dignity in the face of systemic deprivation, while Mill, from the industrial 19th century, captures the truth that moral victories without institutional friction rarely change corporate ledgers. In antiquity, surviving societal collapse with one's humanity intact was the ultimate victory, whereas the Industrial Revolution proved that surviving exploitation must merely be the catalyst for legislating its end. These perspectives can be synthesized. Confucius's ritual solidarity is not the alternative to Mill's structural reform, but its necessary prerequisite, as passengers must first recognize their shared humanity before they can collectively challenge the airline. Yet a fatal paradox remains in this synthesis. If our perfectly ritualized sharing of the airplane recline makes the flight entirely peaceful, the corporate sovereign experiences absolutely no pressure to expand the physical geometry of the economy cabin. Mill, if passengers successfully use Confucius's ritual propriety to quietly and peacefully share this deprived space, how can this silent moral solidarity be weaponized into concrete structural reform without destroying the very peace they just built?
Moderator, to weaponize this polite solidarity without violating the peace, we must transform our shared deprivation into organized economic friction. Imagine a 19th century London omnibus where the proprietor packs in twice the safe number of riders. If passengers politely squeeze together, but collectively sign a public manifesto refusing future patronage until the carriage is expanded, they preserve the peace while bankrupting the tyrant's model. Master Confucius believes our quiet grace is the ultimate victory, yet he overlooks that undocumented virtue merely provides free shock absorbers for corporate greed. Can we not see that true utility requires using our ritualized sharing of this cramped recline as the foundation for a coordinated consumer strike against the airline's geometry?
As moderator, I observe a fascinating synthesis emerging between moral preservation and collective action. Mill, speaking from the 19th century age of mass movements and market reforms, you capture the truth that internal harmony can be weaponized into collective economic pressure without violating the immediate peace. This marks a profound historical shift. In Confucius's 6th century BCE era, commoners could not easily boycott a feudal lord, but Mill's industrial era birthed the power of the organized consumer. You are suggesting that interpersonal peace and systemic reform can be integrated by forming a new horizontal social contract among passengers to boycott the corporate sovereign. Yet this synthesis faces a fatal contractual tension regarding the very nature of the economy class ticket. The passengers willingly purchased these specific seats, actively consenting to the airline's cramped terms in exchange for a cheaper fare. Locke, speaking from your 17th century foundational theories of consent and property, if passengers freely consented to buy these restrictive seats to save money, does organizing a collective rebellion against the airline violate their own original contract? Or does the airline's deceptive geometry, selling the right to recline to the front passenger while selling the same physical knee space to the rear passenger, render that initial consent fundamentally invalid?
Moderator. The passenger's initial consent is fundamentally void, for no legitimate compact can transfer the exact same physical property to two individuals simultaneously. Mr. Mill rightly champions collective resistance, because the airline's geometric deception mathematically engineers a state of war. Imagine a 17th-century landlord who secretly leases the exact same cellar to a baker for ovens and a merchant for gunpowder, claiming both consented for a discount. When the inevitable explosion occurs, we do not blame the tenants. We condemn the landlord's fraudulent contract. Rebelling against this spatial theft rightfully reclaims our natural liberty.